Welcome to the second episode of the Reti Nimzo Larsen Speedrun series. In this particular episode, we are going to be playing against players in the rating range of 700 to 800. And throughout the couple of games that you're going to see in this video, you're going to see examples of opponents who are making a lot of different opening mistakes. You're going to see two different games where my opponents give us a free pawn in the center of the board very, very early in the game. We're going to talk about how to exploit our opponents. Once we do get that free material, we're going to be able to convert the advantage into a win. You're also going to see a game where my opponent gives up a ton of space control in the middle of the board, plays a bad move at the start of the game as well. So that's going to be the focus of the games we jump into right here. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so welcome to this game here. We're going to be continuing, of course, with our Reti Nimzo Larsen approach. After knight f3 here, black is already making a pretty big mistake. I mean, they are putting a pawn in the center of the board, but this is simply not a safe move to play. This is actually quite a common move, I will say, at the lower rating ranges. A lot of people kind of just autopilot the start of the game. They expect white to play the move e4, so they just play the move e5 right away. And if white plays d4, they might still play e5 for kind of what's known as an England gambit. But against knight f3, e5 is actually just quite bad. It's also pretty bad against d4, but the main point here is we are going to go ahead and simply be able to capture the pawn for free. I'm now just going to go ahead and put a pawn in the center of the board. Yeah, we're just up a pawn, and it is also a central pawn, which is very nice for us. Black plays the move d5 themselves. Okay, so they're down the pawn, but they're at least kind of fighting for control of the center. Lots of moves are good. I think I'm going to go ahead and play this almost like a Queen's Gambit type of position. I'm going to go for the move c4, try to eliminate my opponent's kind of leftover or remaining central pawn. Try to get rid of that, not let them have that. That's going to be the idea here. So they do take the pawn. It is entirely possible to take back with the knight right away. I might just go ahead and do that. Another option here is to play the move e3 and try to regain the pawn with the bishop. That's also a pretty good looking move at the same time. I think I'm going to go for that route a little bit more. I'm a little more wanting to develop a new piece rather than moving the knight a third time in the opening. We've already moved it twice. Let's play the move e3 and try to regain the pawn on c4. And then also we'll be attacking the pawn on f7, which will be nice. Now, it is possible for black here. They could have played the move pawn to b5 to reinforce the c4 pawn. But usually in a lot of kind of Queen's Gambit type of situations, these early b5 moves can be a bit risky. If they had played b5, we would have been able to play a move like a4 and try to get rid of the b5 pawn. But in this case, black plays the move knight to c6. We are up a pawn, so I'm a bit leaning towards just simply trading the knights. I don't really want to take with the bishop and allow them to take and double our pawns and take our queen, and we won't be able to castle, and stuff like that looks kind of iffy. So I'm just going to go ahead and trade the knight. They're going to recapture. And once they recapture, then we will take the pawn on c4, and we'll just be up a pawn with a big space advantage in the center, 2 pawns versus our opponent's 0. And we'll just work on developing the rest of our pieces. And yeah, white's in pretty good shape here. The only thing we'll have to be a little bit careful about with the upcoming middle game is that I am missing a lot of like piece protection around my king side. So if black had played a move like maybe bishop d6 and tried to attack me, I would have to be a little bit careful about that because I don't have a lot of defenders on the king side. But in this case, black makes a check with their bishop. I could block with the knight. I could block with the bishop. Since I'm up a pawn, and I also have this bad bishop on c1, this bishop is restricted by my other dark pawns, or dark square pawns that are in the center of the board. I'm going to go ahead and play bishop d2, and if he wants to trade bishops, I am more than happy to do that here. Okay, black plays the move c5. They are reinforcing the bishop. It's possible to take on c5, but the fact that when they play the move c5, they have actually opened up this diagonal towards the opponent, towards their king. This gives me some ideas for tactical operations we could think about. There is a check on a4 right away that's available. We could also trade the bishops and then give the check on a4. If we check on a4 right away, black is going to be able to block with their bishop and counterattack the queen. And the queen doesn't really have a great place to move from there immediately. But if I trade the bishops first and then give the check, not only will I be hitting the king, but I'll also be attacking that that pawn on b4, after the pawn recaptures on b4. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take on b4. They're going to recapture. And now we're going to make this check with queen a4. We hit the king, we hit the pawn. The other nice thing is that once the pawn on c5 is gone, there's less pressure on my center, and so my center gets to stay a lot more secure in the middle of the board. So they played the move c6. Now, so I have two options here. I can take the pawn on b4, which was my original plan, or I can take the pawn on c6, which continues to fork and attack black's pieces. If I take on c6, the one slight trickiness there is they go bishop to d7, my queen has to move again, and I'm sure that's an absolutely great position for white, but I'm actually going to take the b4 pawn. I'm preventing my opponent from castling. I'm going to castle myself pretty soon. And I don't really want to give them free moves to develop and kick my queen around and attack the queen and stuff like that. So I'm sure that both moves are good. I'm sure taking on c6 is probably computer approved, but I think taking on b4 is a better practical choice. Prevent castling, and we don't get the queen kicked around too many times here. So difficult position for black. They do launch the knight forward. Not really anything that this is threatening that I'm concerned about. Maybe they want to try some queen f6, queen h4. I think a lot of players kind of rely on something like this maybe working, or at least they try to do something like this, which is understandable given the fact that they're already down 2 pawns. They might as well try for some tricks. I think the simplest thing here is probably just to play the move knight to c3. They might also be trying to play knight d6 to block the diagonal, so maybe that's an idea that they're going for. Yeah, I think I'm just going to go for knight to c3. Attack the knight that's in the center. I'd be very happy to trade pieces at this point. They do go for the move pawn to c5. Now, this move is actually quite tricky. I hadn't kind of anticipated this. If I take the pawn on c5, I would actually get myself checkmated, which is very, very bad. Black would be able to swing the queen down to the d2 square, supported by the knight. And then once the king moves away, queen takes f2 would be checkmate. So it is actually a tricky move for my opponent. Kudos to them for seeing this. First of all, though, that being said, I'm not going to take the pawn, since I do recognize that would be a blunder. But I do need to move the queen if that's the case. I don't want to, get the queen captured either. So I can check on a4 or b5. I'm a bit more leaning towards a4. Black can block with the bishop. But then maybe I can block with my own bishop and try to trade pieces. And again, trading pieces is generally going to be pretty good for us. So I am going to check on a4. If we had checked on b5 and the bishop blocked, it would have been a bit trickier because we would not have been able to block with our bishop on b5 when the queen is already there. So they do block with the bishop. I'm going to go bishop b5. I block off the attack, and I'm very happy to trade extra pieces. They take me, I take back with check. Keep in mind, I'm also attacking the knight on e4, so they have to still be kind of careful about that in this position. So they take me on d4, but this doesn't really address the threat of me taking the knight on e4. I could take the bishop on d7 first, or I can take the knight on e4 first. I don't really know if there's a huge difference between the two. I'm just going to go ahead and take the bishop first with check. If they take with the queen, I'm very happy to trade the queens with check, and then we will capture the knight in the center of the board. And okay, now we're up a full piece. Should be relatively smooth sailing here. Okay, I do have to move the knight, so let's move the knight to c5. We will give a check, and then we're going to take the pawn on d4 to defend the knight after that. So let's take the pawn. The only thing I have to be slightly careful about is the king being in the center of the board, but I think the king will be pretty safe on like the d2 or d3 squares. Pretty hard for the rooks to attack when I've got the pawn on d4 shielding the d-file. So I can move up to guard the pawn. Might also be good to just drop the knight back to guard the pawn, and then I can start to use the open files for my rooks. And again, because I'm up a pawn, I'm up a couple pawns and the knight, I'm very happy to trade pieces. So let's throw in a check first. See where the king decides to move to. And then probably next we go bring the other rook over. This is probably just the simplest route. And yeah, again, if the rooks get traded, we're very happy. If they avoid the trade, we can also invade. So let's just go ahead and trade the rooks. Offer another trade. If they avoid the trade somewhere, we can give a check. And of course, if they trade rooks, then we are smooth sailing at this point. Up a knight, up a couple pawns. The game plan here, even if we were to head the knight, the game plan would probably be to focus on using my passed pawn in the center of the board. Just push it up the board, supported by the king and the rook. And yeah, not a whole lot that black is going to be able to do here. Okay, they move the rook away to avoid the trade, which is probably the better decision. That being said, the check on e7 is still going to allow me to pick up a free pawn. I'll take the a7 pawn because now I am going to maybe check and trade rooks after the king moves. Let's give the check. I could have, of course, taken the h7 pawn, but again, I'm just going to get the rooks off the board. And then I'm going to start pushing my pawns. He's probably going to try f3, hoping that I play too quickly and let him capture my g2 pawn. But if he plays f3, I'll just take his pawn. Okay, we'll just push both the a and d pawns up the board. We can just also involve the king. Push the d pawn. The knight is kind of covering the c5 square, so he's not really going to be able to stop both of these pawns simultaneously. He's going to have to move towards one of them, then move towards the other one. And yeah, okay. I'm going to let him take the knight. I don't really care. I'm just going to make a queen. Make the queen. Give a check. Move the king here. There is no stalemate because he has a bunch of pawns that are available to move. And next move, I can check anywhere on the a file and deliver the checkmate in this position. Okay, he pushes the f3 pawn, and we can just deliver the checkmate here. Okay, so we got the win in this one. So main thing in this example, or in this particular game, first of all, the opponent loses a pawn on the very first move of the game. You'd be surprised at how often this will occur even in your own games. You'll develop the knight. If you're using this opening repertoire, you'll develop the knight. They'll push the pawn very quickly because they're just, that's what they usually do, is put the pawn on e5 as black, and then you'll be able to just take the knight, take the pawn for free. So the main point I'd say behind this game, though, is once you are ahead material, we're up the pawn in this game right at the start. It's very important to have a kind of good game plan for what to do next. Part of that game plan definitely does involve trading pieces, simplifying the game, getting pieces off of the board, getting to the end game, kind of like how things occurred in the game. But at the same time, you don't want to just mindlessly chase trades all over the place. You still have to play good, solid moves in the opening and the middle game as well. You still have to develop your pieces, still control the center of the board, still castle your king at some point. So don't forget the principles and kind of the basic goals of the opening, even if you do start off with some advantage at the beginning of the game. So I did control the center, fought for more control of the center, traded pieces, developed new pieces. I was happy to trade the bishops when he gave the check. And then it's also important to note, something that I'll probably say plenty of times throughout these, speedrun videos and any other videos I make on YouTube. Whenever the opponent makes a move, or also whenever you make a move at a position, there's always something that changes. If a piece is developed, it was maybe controlling a certain square that it's no longer controlling. If a pawn is pushed, maybe a certain diagonal is opened, or maybe a certain square is gained more control of and a different square is lost control of. So in a case like this, when black pushes the pawn up to c5, the first thing that I recognized is not only is the bishop being protected, but I also recognize that when this pawn is missing on c6, this diagonal is opened up towards the king. And so now I have ideas of queen a4 check available at the right time, or bishop b5 check is also available. So I did want to work out the best way to do things. I do believe that trading the bishops, then giving the check, and taking the pawn was good to go for. I didn't necessarily want to take this pawn. I'm sure this is also good too. Black could block with the bishop. I move away. Maybe they attack the queen again one day. Yeah, I'm sure white is still much, much better here, but I didn't really want to let black develop pieces for free. I took the b pawn instead. Look for more trades. Kudos to my opponent for trying out the c5 move. I do think against other players, they might just take the pawn and walk right into this checkmate trick, which would be very bad to walk into. So I avoid that, though. I gave the check, blocked with the bishop. Trade stuff, because, again, we're ahead material from the start. Win a new piece, and then the rest of the game is pretty smooth sailing. You just want to defend against your opponent's threats, take away their counterplay, trade pieces. Eventually, once you have the only piece left on the board, then you start pushing pawns, make a queen. That's pretty much the way that this that this game worked out. We eventually made a queen and delivered the checkmate. All right, so that's it for this game. I'll see you in the next one. Let's get into the next game. So we have knight f3 on the board here, playing against a version 25, rated 760 from the United States. Let's see what they decide to do. They do pawn to f6. Okay, so definitely not a great looking move. You're taking away the square from the knight. I think Ben Feingold's the one that says never play f6 or f3. And yeah, on move one especially, it's not going to be great. But that being said, maybe black wants to play e5. We could play e4. We could play d4. I think, as I've said in some of the previous games in this in this kind of speedrun series, if the opponent's playing weird stuff at the start of the game, we don't need to just autopilot our b3 move. I'm just going to go for d4. If they play e5, I'm happy to just take the pawn for free. If they don't play e5, well, in this case, they're playing the move knight to c6. I think we can just continue advancing in the center here. I see no problem with just pushing the pawn forward up the board, attacking the knight. Knight goes to the b4 square. We could play a3 to kick the knight back to a6. I don't really see any reason not to do that either. So let's boot the knight back to the a6 square. And once the knight goes back to a6, we'll play the move e4. We'll just grab all the space in the center, and we will be in good shape with a pretty big space advantage, which is nice for us. Okay, the knight does go back. Let's just grab all the central space. Our opponent has moved this knight 1, 2, 3, 4 times. No pawn moves in the center of the board. Not a very principled way of playing the opening by any stretch of the imagination. They are attacking the pawn on e4, though. I'm just going to go ahead and play knight to c3. Let's develop a piece and guard the pawn. We've got 2 pieces in the game. Big space advantage. The opponent has 1 piece. No pawns in the center. They do finally play a move that does at least put a little bit of pressure on our central pawn. Now, I'm definitely not in a rush to make this capture. There's no need to trade off this e-pawn for the opponent's e6 pawn. It's a pawn on the 5th rank for an opponent's pawn on the 6th rank. I'd really rather just, I guess, wait for them to take so that I can bring a piece further up the board. That being said, I think I'll just play the move, probably just b4 here, attack the knight, kick it back to the a6 square once again, and kind of just say to black, you know, okay, you've moved the knight a billion different times, and it's going to go to the edge of the board anyways, and yeah, it's just just a very sad-looking location for the knight to be on. I think here, probably leaning towards just developing the bishop at this point. I don't really see a reason not to do that. There might be other moves that are good here as well. I think I'm just going to develop the bishop, though. Get castled. And again, this knight moved once, twice, 3, 4, 5 times in the first 8 moves of the game. No other pieces are in the game. Knight's on the edge. Lots of pawns in the center. Lots of pieces. This knight going to e7 also doesn't look fantastic. It is blocking the bishop that's on the f8 square. I suppose the knight can go to the g6 square, but okay, the knight's going to have to move another time in order to accomplish that. I think I'm just going to go ahead and castle. I don't see any reason not to. The pawn on e6, we do attack it twice, but it is also protected twice. I'm not in a rush to take there. I'm also really not in a rush to take the knight on a6 because this knight has moved a ton of different times. It's on the edge of the board. It's not getting back towards the middle of the board anytime soon. I'm not in a rush to trade off, you know, a relatively active piece for this knight that's on the edge of the board. So I'm just going to go ahead and castle. I'm going to assume my opponent puts the knight on g6. Okay, they decide to put the pawn on g6 instead. Let's see here. I do want to start some kind of fireworks in the center of the board before black gets to castle their king. If they get to play bishop g7 and castle, I think we're still in very good shape there, no doubt. But I think we can start to open lines up and put some pressure on our opponent. So I think here I'm leaning towards... Actually, I'm starting to lean towards taking the pawn on e6 in order to open up lines for my pieces and maybe take the queen and keep the king marooned in the center of the board and stuff like that. So trying to just figure out, is there anything that's even better? Pawn to e5 is another move to consider here that would be working towards opening up the center of the board. I might even start with that. Maybe I'll start with pawn to e5 and kind of see what black does. Yeah, I think I'll do this. Let's go for pawn to e5. I'm just trying to nuke the center of the board. Might even jump the knight into the e4 square to attack a couple of these squares in black's half of the board. They do play bishop g7. Um, Here I am now leaning towards... I don't know if I want to take on f6 because that does kind of allow that bishop to pin my knight, which is slightly annoying for sure. Knight e4 is an option. Pawn takes d6 is still an option, or pawn takes e6 is still an option. Pawn to d6 is also an option. That's maybe not too bad. I think I am, though, going to trade the pawns on e6. I have a feeling this is probably not the best move, but it does lead to, I think, a very pleasant position. I think we're going to be pretty happy with the outcome of things, as we'll see. I'm assuming they'll take back. They could take the e5 pawn. Okay, so they decided to take the e5 pawn. I don't really think that's a great idea, because now I believe I can play knight to g5 and try to hop the knight into the f7 square, and this looks very, very dangerous for black. I don't even need to take the pawn on d7 anymore because maybe, I don't know, maybe they take with the queen, and now I kind of want to keep the queens on the board at this point. So I think I'm going to go knight g5. This knight f7 move is a huge threat. Not only is it making the fork, but it's also simply trapping the queen. If the king castles, that's going to line the king up with my bishop, and I'll be able to make some discovered checks available at that point. And if they take the pawn, I can trade queens and then check on f7. So they decide to castle the king, but this does walk right into the lineup of the bishop, and I just need to get this pawn on e6 out of the way. I can take the pawn on d7 with check. The king has to move away, and then probably I'll just take the bishop on c8. That's probably just the simplest option. But yeah, black is losing material here for sure, and things are looking pretty bad for them. Okay, king decides to move. I could check on f7, but the rook takes, bishop takes, they get the pawn. I'd be up the exchange, but generally speaking, if you have the choice between winning the exchange, like a rook for a minor piece, or winning a full piece outright, like the bishop in this case, usually it's going to be a lot better to win the full piece outright. So I take the bishop, promotes to a queen, but the queen is going to be captured pretty quickly. I can still go for the check on f7, which looks quite good. If the king moves to g8, we'll once again have a bunch of discovered checks. I think after this, black has to take the knight. We recapture, and then we're just going to be up an entire rook with a very, very large advantage in this position. So up a rook, knight's on the bad square on the side of the board, bishop is somewhat blocked in. The game plan now is just to trade pieces, maybe continue attacking the king, but we have a large enough advantage material-wise that we can just work towards trading pieces at this point. So black does push the pawn. They do have a threat of capturing the knight on c3. I think I'm just going to play the move bishop to b2. Let's break the pin. Maybe I'll move the knight away later, guard my bishop, and offer some trades towards the opponent's king. I was also considering an idea like bishop e3. This is actually kind of a nice little tricky trap-looking idea. If black was to take the knight on c3, then we would be able to check on the diagonal and actually deliver checkmate pretty soon. However, I don't think bishop e3 worked because maybe black would have attacked my bishop on f7 first or something like that. But anyways, though, no need to be overly fancy. We just protect the knight. Black does move the queen up and attack my bishop. I'm just gonna retreat the bishop back to a safe location. No need to be doing anything fancy. And now that I'm up an entire rook, maybe I will trade off the bishop for the knight, but once again, I'm still not in a rush for that just yet because, again, the knight's just stuck on the edge of the board. So no rush to take that guy. I prevent the opponent's rook from coming to the open file. Maybe soon I'll play like rook queen e2 or rook e1 to go after the e4 pawn. Yeah, looking pretty tough for black here. Okay, they play c6. Maybe they're trying to bring the knight to the c7 square, but that doesn't really bother me all that much. Let's see here. How do I want to handle things at this point? I think I'll thinking about moving the queen up to the d6 square. Maybe queen e2 is a little bit simpler. I'll just attack the pawn on e4. I'm not really threatening to take it just yet since my knight on c3 is pinned, but maybe I'll play rook b1 and then once the bishop is protected, then I can take the pawn. I'm also aiming at the knight on a6, so maybe I'll take the knight and, you know, once they recapture, pick up the pawn on a6. But again, no need for any funny business, no need for anything fancy. We're just going to get the pieces in the game, take the stuff that's weak, trade the pieces when it's available or when it's favorable, and go from there. So I think black is going to try bishop e5. I mean, he moves the queen up here and maybe signals some kind of attempt at throwing in a mate threat. I think for that reason, I'm just going to go with the simple option. I'm just going to go with the move knight to d1. I do move away and keep my bishop protected, and I simply want to trade these bishops. The less pieces on the board, the less trouble my opponent's going to be able to stir up, and so I'm just trying to get the pieces off the board at this point. If I could get the queens off the board, that would be fantastic. Maybe queen e3 was another move that was available there, but okay, getting the bishops off the board with the guaranteed trade also looks pretty good to me at this point. So they do take, I'll take back. Now, if I could somehow deliver a check on this diagonal, it would be very, very close to checkmate. So maybe I'll try to go queen e3, queen c3, or something like that. Queen e3 to d4. Trying to get the trying to get the check on the diagonal there. Another option is just to go ahead and take the knight and not go for the mate, but you know what? I think I'll just involve the final piece in the game first. Let's go rook d1, and then again maybe queen d2, queen e3, offer a queen trade as well as threatening the mate idea. So they go knight f5. I'm going to go queen to d2 to offer the trade. If they trade, that's fine with me. If they don't, they also have to be a bit careful about the queen c3 check. Maybe queen e5 is their best move to block the check and hit the knight, but then I might go ahead and take the knight, activate my knight, and I'm just going to take stuff, trade pieces, throw in little threats and little tactics when available. That's kind of the game plan from here. So first of all, we are threatening black's queen. They got to do something about that. And yeah, maybe we take the knight, maybe we check. Okay, black decides to retreat the queen back here. I think I will throw in the check on c3. They need to probably block with the knight on g7 at this point. If they block with the queen on e5, we're pretty happy to trade queens. And if they block with the rook, it doesn't look great to pin the rook. But okay, they block with the knight. I think for the sake of simplicity, mainly because my knight on b2 is kind of bad, I'm just going to take the knight on a6. And then once they recapture, now the knight will come into the game on the c4 square. And yeah, I finally made that trade of bishop for knight, but it's mainly because I wanted to activate my my final minor piece. And now this knight can jump to d6. Maybe I'll double up the rooks. Try to go after the knight on g7 that's pinned one day. Maybe knight to a5, attacking the pawn. Lots of moves are pretty good here. And again, we're just up an entire rook. No need to be super fancy. Oh, we're also down on time, but I think we have plenty of time on the clock to get the job done here. So how will black play? Okay, they play the move h5. I'm going to do... Let's do queen f6. As soon as they push the h-pawn, they did weaken the g6 pawn, so I'm going to poke around at that and create a threat. Rook to d6 would have actually been pretty good as well. That's another way of attacking the pawn. The king moves up to guard the pawn. I think now we'll play the move rook to d6. Attacking the pawn on g6 a second time. And it doesn't look easy for black to protect it. I don't really see a great way for them to guard the pawn. If they try to put anything in the way on e6, I'll just go ahead and take it. Otherwise, we're taking the pawn on g6 next move. And once we take the pawn on g6, very close to checkmating black, and we'd also be forking the king and the rook, so maybe we can take the rook if the knight on g7 ever moves out of the way. So, okay, they decide to go to the g8 square. Let's just go ahead and take the pawn. Now the knight's pinned. And next, we'll probably double up the rooks and try to put the rook on the 7th rank. Usually when you have a rook on an open file, as we do with the rook on d6, you want to try to invade into your opponent's half of the board. Right now we're on the d6 square, but we'd really like to be on the d7 square. That would be even better. And so double the rooks up, play rook d7. That would be looking pretty good there. So I could check with the rook, push the king over, but I don't know if that really does a ton. So I think I'm just going to stick with the idea of doubling up and then try to go to d7 and try to checkmate, maybe on the f7 square or take the knight. Rook to d7 would make a pretty big fork along the 7th rank at this point. So we'll see what black tries to do to defend against it. Maybe rook e7 is an idea. We could have also taken the pawn on c6. Okay, black decides to play the move queen f7, trying to trade the queens. But I don't need to trade the queens. I can make the move rook to f6 to pin the queen, protected by my queen. And yeah, we're just winning the queen here. And then we'll also bring the other rook down to the 7th rank after we pick up black's queen. They do take the rook. We take with check. King has to go to g8. Then we'll play the move rook to d7. If black was able to get to this opened file, I probably would just want to throw in a move like h3 just to make sure no funny business with the back right checkmate occurs. But because the rook is really never going to be able to get to the open file, I don't really need to worry about that. I am simply threatening checkmate. Black does not defend, and we do take the knight and get the checkmate. So yeah, we get the job done here on this one. So we start off with our knight f3 move, which is characteristic for the Reti Nimzo Larsen. But as I've said in other videos in the speedrun, if black is not playing a principled opening move, if they're not playing moves like d5, knight f6, c5, e6, they're not playing something that's kind of focused around the center of the board. In those kind of situations, if they're playing b6, b5, a6, g6, f6, just stuff that's not really in the middle, it's more on the edges of the board, then you want to kind of step out of the autopilot mode of just saying, oh, I'm going to play knight f3 and b3 against everything. You want to focus more on the center of the board. So if they're not controlling the center, after knight f3, you go e4, you go e4, you go d4, and you look to expand quite heavily around the middle of the board there. Sorry about that. My ring hit the table. But yeah, so they played f6 in this game. We go d4. They go knight c6. We just continue expanding. We kick this knight around all over the place. Gained a lot of space in the center. Continued kicking the knight. Our opponent's moves in the opening are just not so great. We do want to try to punish what they're doing, and of course that's kind of how the game went at one point. But it's also important not to do anything too crazy yourself before you've followed the opening principles yourself as well. So here we developed, controlled the center, we castled, and then we started to consider opening up the position. So this is where e5 comes, and then take the pawn, and then we start to move pieces a second time and make threats, and kind of, we don't develop every single piece before we start attacking, but we do have to still develop a couple of pieces before we can just start, going after the opponent's king. They make some tactical mistakes. We picked up the bishop due to that discovered check here. And then once we're up the piece, and then once here we're up a full rook, it's all about just consolidating things, trading stuff, thinking. And a lot of the times you want to very much focus on not only what you want to do, but also think, how could the opponent create some counterplay or create some trouble for me? And try to just eliminate those ideas. So I think here, for instance, when black played queen f4, I thought that they might want to play bishop e5 to attack me. So I just thought, let's get rid of the bishops right away, and now they have less, trouble that they can stir up. So as things went on, we attacked stuff, we won stuff, and eventually got the checkmate. So that's going to do it for this game. Hopefully you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you in the next one then. So here's the next game. We're playing against Docky and Crocky. We're starting off with the move knight f3. This is another person who's kind of just throwing the e5 move out there, not really thinking about what they're doing, just putting the pawn in the center of the board. They throw out this move queen to f6. Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and play the move pawn to d4. Let's protect the knight. Could have also retreated the knight back to f3. Okay, so now that they're attacking the knight, I will go back to the f3 square here at this point. And yeah, just like I said in one of the previous games in the video series, people are sometimes just playing very early e5 moves. You'll find that your opponents are just kind of giving you pawns for free in some of these games at this rating level. So you start off with knight f3, they give you the e5 pawn, you take it, and you play the rest of the game up pawn. Okay, so they go for bishop g4. I'm not too concerned about black taking the knight and doubling my pawns. That's not really too big of a problem for me. I don't necessarily want to play e4 because if they take, I would have to take with the g pawn. I have to keep a little bit of an eye on the d pawn here. I think I'm going to start first with the move knight to c3. Pawn to c4 first also looks quite good. Maybe I'll just do that. I'll go pawn to c4. Let's grab as much space as we can. It's usually a pretty good idea, as we've seen in plenty of other games. Then knight c3, then e4 or e3, and kind of just see what black does. The knight on c3 may also be able to jump up to the d5 square at some point, which could be useful. Okay, so here black is putting more pressure on the d4 pawn. I could push forward and attack the knight. Definitely possible to do that here. Another option is to put the bishop out here on g5 and attack the queen. I think what I'm going to do, though, I'm just going to play pretty solidly at this point, I think. I'm leaning towards the move e3. That being said, the more I think about it, yeah, I think I'm just going to go for d5, actually. Let's just expand in the center, develop next with our knight, and look to have a pretty big space advantage with the extra pawn that we are happy to have here. So they move the knight to the b4 square. So if you want to take the chance to pause the video, or at least think here for a moment yourself, see if you can figure out the best way to play, because knight to b4 does end up being a mistake here at this point. And the way to punish this move is to recognize that there is an open diagonal towards the king. There is a knight on b4 that is unprotected. There is the ability to give a check on a4. And also, if we check and attack the knight as well as the king, the knight can't go back to block the check because the pawn was covering that square. So queen to a4 check simply forks the king and the knight. And black is going to lose a piece in this position. They might block with their bishop. They might block with the pawn. I'm not really sure. If they do block with the knight, we'll take with our pawn. Anything else, we'll take the knight with the queen. And yeah, black's in bad shape here. Okay, they decide to block with the pawn. We don't want to take the pawn because then the knight will recapture and they will avoid losing the piece. So I'm just going to go ahead and take the knight. We're also attacking the b7 pawn. So black has to be a little bit careful about that. They end up taking the pawn on d5. So rather than recapturing on d5, which is a totally fine move in this position, I'm leaning towards taking the pawn on b7 with the queen and attacking the rook. I think I'm just going to go for that option. Let's take the pawn, hit the rook. We might also come back and pick up the pawn on d5 once the rook moves to safety. Also depends a little bit on where the rook moves. Okay, so the rook goes to the d8 square. Here, there is a queen and rook lined up on the same diagonal together. And this means that we actually have the ability to punish this. We have the ability to win material, or kind of further material here, with the move bishop to g5. We attack the queen, we attack the rook behind the queen, we make what's known as a skewer. Black cannot take the pawn on b2 since our queen is protecting this pawn, so that would be important to note before you play the bishop g5 move. But yeah, the queen is going to have to move somewhere, and then we'll take the queen on. We'll take the rook after the queen moves. In this case, the queen doesn't move, but the rook moves instead to counterattack our queen. There's a number of moves that are good. You could take the rook and kind of kamikaze the queen since you're going to take black's queen next move anyways. That is entirely possible. I think it's going to be even better to check on c8, attack the king. If the queen blocks, the bishop is still covering that d8 square. In this case, the rook blocks, counterattacking the queen. I could, once again, take the rook And then regardless of how black recaptures, I will, I'll either take the queen on f6 or take the queen on d8. It is possible to take the bishop on g4. That was actually by what I was leaning towards by playing queen c8 in the first place. But now that I look at it a little more, if I take the bishop on g4, the queen could take the pawn on b2, which gets a little bit murky. They'd be attacking my rook. They'd even have some queen c1 checks if I'm not careful there. So I think that being said, rather than taking the bishop, which was my original intention, I am going to take the rook on d8. And the nice thing is that regardless of how black recaptures, my bishop is going to either take the queen on f6 or on d8. So the bishop still covers that. I will take the pawn back on d5 finally. And that being said, we're up an entire rook plus a couple pawns in this position, and we are in very good shape. So the pawn goes to g5. I can grab this pawn as well, attacking this pawn on f7. Now I'll just continue developing my pieces. Black did protect the pawn. Here I can go ahead and I think I'll just go ahead and attack the bishop. I don't know if I want to use the f pawn or the h pawn. Let's use the h pawn, I guess. Probably push the pawn up to e4 pretty soon, develop my light square bishop, and yeah, we are going to be ahead of rook as well as a few pawns with a pretty substantial advantage. So we'll see what black does here. Bishop. Okay, bishop goes back to the h5 square. I think I'll just go ahead and play the move e3. e4 is also entirely fine. I just want to move the bishop to d3 and not have it be blocked in by my own pawn in the center. So we just push the pawn one square instead of two, and then we develop the bishop soon. I could take the pawn on h7 here, but I'm going to prioritize developing. I'm going to play bishop to d3. Might take the pawn a little bit later, depending on what black does. But mainly here, I'm just going to try to castle, get my rooks in the game, and use my extra material. The main thing is here, if you're ahead material, but then you're not developing and using those pieces, then it doesn't really feel like you're ahead the material in the first place. Okay, so black just made the move pawn to f5. As I've mentioned in other videos, whenever your opponent makes a move, not only do you want to try to figure out why they played the move, but you also want to think about what did their move change about the position. So when the pawn was on f7, it was protecting the e6 and g6 squares. Now it is no longer protecting, for instance, the e6 square. We can actually jump in and fork the king as well as the bishop, and the knight is protected by the pawn. So we make the check. We will take the bishop next move. Instead of grabbing the pawn on h7, going for this check is much better. And black is just losing more and more material as the game goes on. So probably it's best for black to take the knight rather than losing a full piece, but it's still going to be very bad for them. Okay, we take here, we hit the rook, we hit the bishop. Once the rook moves away, we'll take the bishop, or if the bishop moves, we'll take the rook. We are just grabbing more and more material. We're up a rook, two minor pieces, a couple pawns. Lots of stuff is in our favor here. All right, so I'm just going to go king to d2. Let's activate the rook on the c file next move. And then probably just start checking and putting the knight on annoying squares for black. Let's line up towards the king. Let's give this check. Invade with the rook. Double the rooks up. And try to deliver checkmate somewhere around the corner. Okay, rook here, hits my pawn. Don't think I'm too concerned about that. I'll just double up the rooks. And then I'll come down here and give a sequence of checks. I think we have checkmate in 1, 2, I think 3 moves here. Check on c7, king goes back. Check on c8, king moves up. And then we check with the other rook, and that is the checkmate. Okay, so as I said in one of the previous games, opponents will sometimes, after we play the move knight f3 at the start of the game, I think this is already the second time we've seen it in the game in the list of games so far. Our opponent just plays the move e5 and just gives us a free pawn at the start of the game. surprisingly, it's relatively common, as we're seeing here. So if you play knight f3 yourself and you're in this rating range, you very well might have opponents who just give you pawns for free, and that gives you a very nice start to the game. So definitely a good endorsement for the opening if people are just going to give away pawns on move number 1 of the game. So we protect the knight, and the main thing here, as we see in a lot of these games, I'm really just trying to play around the center of the board, especially if the opponent's not playing principled moves. They're not developing their king side. They're not controlling the center. I'm just pushing pawns in the center, controlling the center myself, developing pieces, being aware or cognizant of what my opponent's threats are or what they're trying to do, but mainly just playing good solid moves, focusing around the middle of the board. So c4, I ended up deciding to hit the knight. This knight jumping to b4 was a mistake due to this fork. And once we kind of continued picking up more and more material, very important once again that even if you're in a much, much better position, you have to still be very alert to what your opponents are trying to do or what little tricks or traps that they could have here. So like I said during the game, I was actually leaning towards taking the bishop at first, and I thought black would take the pawn on b2, and I could easily see somebody making the mistake. They took the pawn on b2. Okay, they're hitting my rook. I'm going to go ahead and take their rook on d8, and then all of a sudden, rather than taking the rook, queen to c1 is a very nasty checkmate here. So very important that you don't just, kind of put blinders on, close your eyes, and focus on just what you're doing yourself. Chess is a two-person game. You are battling against an opponent with every single move. It's not a player PvE or player versus environment game. It's a PvP or player versus player game. So very important that you're always thinking about what they're going to do with their moves, what they're going to do with their, chance that they have to make a move with them with their own pieces. So rather than going after the bishop on g4, I decided to get the queens off the board using a nice little idea there. And then the rest of the game was pretty smooth sailing. We just developed stuff, pick up more pieces, and eventually got the checkmate. Okay, so that's it for this game, and this is the third one in the 700 rating category. So hopefully you've enjoyed these couple of games in this video, and hopefully you'll look forward to the next video in the series that is going to focus on the rating gap of 800 to 900. So I will see you in the next one.